Hey there, everybody. Brad Geiger here with another episode of Webcomics Confidential. And this one is going to be an interesting one. This is a really interesting topic because it's another example of how webcomics have changed so much in the past, it's been almost 20 years. And it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. So let's get right into it. By today, I will have made the announcement on my public website. My Patreon backers have known about this for a few days, and that is this: I am canceling all comic convention appearances going forward. Full stop. Okay? And I want to talk to you guys about why that is. But first, a little history. So, going back to the first book that I wrote with my friends Scott Kurtz, Chris Straub, and Dave Kellett, the How to Make Webcomics book. By the way, that book is still out there. I think it's in its fifth printing at this point. Image Comics keeps cranking that thing out. Great book. By all means, get that book if you enjoy about reading the creative process among four friends. It is very dated now. I flipped through it recently, and when we wrote that book, there was no such thing as Twitter or Facebook, or certainly not Kickstarter or Patreon. It's a great book to read about creativity among four friends. A lot of the information holds up, but there's a lot that's missing. And in that book, each of us had a chance to write one chapter that we really wanted to write about, that we felt really passionate about. And for me, that chapter was comic conventions. As a matter of fact, in the lead-in illustration to that book, it's an illustration of me standing on top of an artist alley table like a carnival barker, exuberant in the comic convention experience. I've got to tell you, the way I feel about comic conventions today is very different. It would be an illustration of me huddled under the table in the fetal position. Comic conventions back in the early 2000s were a fantastic way to make money for an independent cartoonist. The problem is that comic conventions have changed drastically since then. So let's talk about some of those changes. In the early 2000s, going in towards almost 2010, an indie cartoonist could show up to a show, bring their books, and he or she could make a good amount of money selling merchandise built around their independent creation. Today, the shows have become much more centered on number one, celebrity autographs, and number two, cosplay. Now, this is not going to turn into one of those old man who shakes his fist at cosplayers and so forth. I love comic conventions. I still love attending them, and I'll probably go to a lot of the conventions that I'm canceling as a fan, as somebody just to walk the floor. But these shows have a real intrinsic problem from the standpoint of the independent creator, and that is this: most of the people that show up at our table have already spent all their money by the time they get to us. And that means that as an indie creator, I've got to be on somebody's top 3 list before I'm going to see any money out of them. Right? Every person, think of it this way: every person that's showing up at your table at a comic convention has a prioritized list of things that they're willing to spend money on. Most of those people, take a look at what badges are being worn by which people. If you see somebody coming up to you with a VIP badge, that means that they just spent what? $700, $1,000 on celebrity autographs? That means that you better be number 2 on that list, or number 3 on that list at the very least, or else you are not getting any of their money. They have a prioritized spending budget, and if you're not in the top 3 or 4, you're not going to get their money. Okay? And that has made a huge impact. One of the worst shows I ever did. And I love Wizard. By the way, I'm not one of these guys that's down on Wizard. I think Wizard World throws really good conventions. I enjoy myself like crazy, and they've always been super nice to me. And I've always done the Wizard World Philadelphia show because it's literally a show that I can walk to. I'm not doing it this year, but it's been a show that I've done since 2000, maybe 2001. I've always done that show. The worst show I ever did happened to be Wizard World Philadelphia, and it was the year that they had all 5 Star Trek captains, or all 5 actors who played Star Trek captains, and you could get your picture taken with all 5. How many? I mean, listen, a couple of these guys getting up there. They're not going to be around for a whole long time. And you know that this is your maybe one chance to get all these people together for an image, for a picture with you in the image. These things were going for upwards of $1,000. Nobody was spending money at my table that weekend because they had already blown their entire comic convention budget on the 5 captains, or maybe it was 6. I don't know. I did a cartoon about it. I have to go back and look for Tales from the Con. But anyway, you get the picture. This happens everywhere, at every convention. You've got to be in somebody's top 3 list. And listen, I'm very realistic about where I stand in the grand scheme of things. There's a small, God knows I love them, small but precious group of people for whom I am in their top 3. Everybody else, I fall further down the list. I'm realistic about that, okay? But the more that number 1 takes, the more money that is encompassed by number 1, the higher you've got to be on the list in general. And those big ticket celebrity autographs are number 1 for the vast majority of the people that are showing up to comic conventions. The rest of them, a lot of them are showing up for the cosplay, which is fantastic. I love cosplay. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. But if the convention is bringing in people that are just there to watch the cosplay, they're not a whole lot of good to me. As a result, it used to be I could go to a show and make easily a couple $1,000s net. By the way, those of you who are still going to comic conventions and you are talking yourselves into it because of the money you make, please be honest with yourself. Please get used to doing a little bit of honest bookkeeping when it comes to deciding whether this is a good show for you. Here's the bottom line. Should you go to a comic convention, you have to look at your past performance at comic conventions and do real bookkeeping. You can't just look at the amount of money that you made during that show. You have to subtract from that amount of money your costs. That means the costs of the merchandise that you brought out there. If you're one of these people that are doing a comic convention and then think to yourself, oh man, what am I going to make to go sell at the show? You are doing this backwards. You do not do a comic convention and then think, what am I going to take to the show? You do a comic convention where you've got a warehouse full of materials that you have to move. When you've got a warehouse full of merchandise that you need to move, then you go to a comic convention. You don't go to sign yourself up for a comic convention and then think, what am I going to print off on my Epson to go and sell to these people? You're being a schmuck. All right? You need to have merchandise already ready to go, then you go to a comic convention. But that's your number 1 cost. What's the cost of your merchandise? What's the cost to travel to that show? What's the cost for the hotel? What are you gonna spend in eating out that entire weekend? Or a lot of these shows are 3 and 4 days. That's a lot of hotel. That's a lot of eating out. That's a lot of expenses that you need to subtract from the amount of money that you make at this show. And don't forget this. How much money am I losing by not being able to do work? All right. And a lot of you guys, I know you're doing commissions and stuff like that, and that's fine. I feel sorry for those guys that I see at comic conventions that are carrying a commission list back to their hotel room, and they're working until all hours of the night trying to crank these commissions out. Listen, if that's your gig and you're good with it, by all means go for it. I'm honest with myself. I know I couldn't do that. All right. But if you're going to continue to do these shows, by all means, do some honest accounting and decide, is the ROI, is the return on investment good for you? If it is, keep doing the shows. Don't let me talk you out of it. But please, before you kid yourself any further, do the math. I did the math. It wasn't working for me. Here's the other thing that really, this happens to me year after year after year. And that is, somebody came up. I was at Seattle Comic Con, the Emerald City Comic Con out in Seattle, Washington. And this lady walks by, and she did a double take, and she came running over to me. Her face was red. She was her hands were on her mouth. She couldn't believe that I was there. She'd been reading me since I was Greystone Inn. Now that goes back to 2005. She's been reading the comic every day. She loves the comic. She was up. She didn't know I was going to be there. She was thrilled that she was getting a chance to meet me. And of course, I talked to her for a while. The handshake, the photo, that whole thing. That makes you feel good. You like to know that your work is connecting with people like that. And of course, after a suitable amount of time, being the salesperson that I am, I changed the conversation over to the graphic novels that I had displayed on the table. Have you ever seen the graphic novels? She says no. I pick one up and show that it's not just a collection, but I reformat them. So instead of a comic strip, it's a graphic novel. It's a whole reading experience. She couldn't care less. She was not interested in the slightest. She reads my comic every day. She doesn't want to buy anything, and that's okay. By the way, it's not her fault. I don't want her in some imagining where she sees this video and she's like, "Oh, I'm the reason that Brad Guigar isn't doing conventions anymore." No, you're really not. You're not obligated to buy anything. But I am obligated to make good decisions where my business is concerned, and that happens to me enough that I realize that, well, I'm going to get to that in a moment. So pair that with this. On one hand, I've got people walking by my table in Artist Alley for 4 days solid, and for the most part, they are not stopping for what I've got out. They don't care. Now, juxtapose that with this. On the day that I got on the plane to head out to Seattle, I launched my Kickstarter for a print collection of my Evil Inc. After Dark series. I hit the button on that, and 3 hours later, I was at the airport getting ready to... By the way, don't ever do that to yourself. It's too stressful. Holy cats. I was on my phone constantly trying to see what was going on with this Kickstarter. Don't ever launch... Don't ever launch a Kickstarter campaign on the same day you're traveling coast to coast. It's not great. But so I did. And... the entire time that I was sitting in Seattle watching people walk past my Artist Alley table, person after person after person, my phone is going nuts with campaign pledges, people who were backing my Kickstarter campaign, new Patreon backers, and commission requests. 3 things: Kickstarter, Patreon, and commissions. Those notifications were keeping my phone vibrating along on the table the entire 4 days that I was there. And every extra day that I spent at that show, I was falling further and further behind on delivering for these people who did want to pay me for what I do. Do you see how significant that is? I fell an entire week behind on my Patreon content. That's something that I don't screw around with. That's the business right now. All right. I don't screw around with my Patreon content. I was an entire week behind. All right. And my Patreon lagged for a week. And I lost a couple patrons that were dissatisfied with the pace of content that I was putting up there. I wish they would have stayed just a week longer, because by the end of the month, I can proudly say, at the end of March, by the end of this week, by the end of March, we will be able to say that once again, I posted a exclusive post for every day in March. There was just a week there that it lagged. But then in the last 2 weeks of the month, man, we double timed it and got a bunch of content up there to make sure that our Patreon backers were thrilled. That's my goal, okay? But I was falling as I'm sitting there in Seattle watching these people walk by. I'm falling further and further behind on doing stuff for people that were willing to pay me. Okay, and the same thing for Kickstarter. Although that stuff is pretty much well underway, I'm not as much in trouble on that. But if I had another convention in the end of March or April, I'd be putting myself behind the eight ball. And commissions, people are hiring me over. I don't have to be at a comic convention to get commissions. All right, and those, if you work them well, do really, really well. I offer commissions all the time. I did commissions on my site for years. Nobody was interested. All right? I offer them at Patreon, and I offer them for a slight discount over what I publish as my usual rate, with the idea being I'll give you a little discount if you let me use this as content for my Patreon. They're more than happy to do it. They're more than happy to pay me to do work that I'm going to turn around and use on Patreon as more content to get more Patreon backers. And by the way, it's not a, hey, by the way, I pulled the wool over their eyes or something. This is out on the table. Everybody knows what they're getting into, and they're thrilled. And I get extra money for doing a commission. That's fantastic. That stuff is working. Comic conventions are not working. And it took me a long time. In fact, man, I tossed and turned over this before I finally decided that I wasn't doing Wizard World Philadelphia, a show that I've done for 16 years consecutively, easily. A show that I can walk to. It's still too much. All right? It's too much. A show that between you and me and the Fence book, for the last several years, I've had all my costs covered by the show. Okay? Last year, I had all my major costs covered by the show. I still lost money. I got to be honest with you. That's when you take a good solid look at your business expenses and you see that the costs outweigh the profits, and you say, listen, I can't do this anymore. All right? Comic conventions are out. And that's definitely where I stand. And I think that you've got to take a very hard look at where you stand with comic conventions before you decide to do them. Let me tell you this right now. I am right now planning on releasing a second edition of the Webcomics Handbook because there's so much, as we've been saying throughout this show, so much that has changed so drastically. How to make webcomics, pretty obsolete. Webcomics Handbook, still lots of solid information in there, but badly in need of an update. And it's going to happen this year. As soon as I get done with this Kickstarter, the next thing on the plate is to start funneling information, editing, reformatting, rewriting, and getting that book ready for probably this fall. I'll be kickstarting that, all right? But the illustration in that How to Make Webcomics was me on a table. I use that same illustration, but the lead-in the Webcomics Handbook said, listen, things have changed a lot from there, and my admonition for the Webcomics Handbook was to say, take a hard look at that. Again, I'm actually, forget about the illustration of me in the fetal position under the table. Let me be honest with you for a second. Right now, the big decision I have to make with that is whether there should be a chapter about comic conventions at all in this book. That's how serious this situation is. The chapter on comic conventions in the second edition of the Webcomics Handbook might be one page, and that page just says don't. So that's where we stand on comic conventions right now. For me, it's a full stop. For you, you may decide that you're still getting something out of it. If that's the case, please do yourself a favor. Do the math before you make any further decisions. You may be sending yourself further down the rabbit hole, going into debt for something that isn't going to make a return on investment for you. And keep in mind, those other two things that you're telling yourself may not be true. And I know you're saying it because I see it on webcomics all the time. I go there for networking and I go there for promotion. Okay, you can do both of those things without an artist alley table or without a booth. You don't need to exhibit at a show to network. That for sure. If you're promoting without a table, I think you're poaching, and that's not really cool. But you don't need to have a table there to network. You can go and network your buns off and do a fantastic time. If networking is really important to you, as you say it is, you can certainly network without having a table. And promotion, my friends, this is 2017. If it ain't clickable, it ain't promotion. That flyer that you're handing somebody, there's only one reason to hand somebody a flyer at a comic convention, and that is if you've got a map back to your table printed on the bottom of that flyer so that if they do see something on that flyer that's interesting to them, they can find you again before the show ends. That's the only reason to hand out a flyer. If you think they're going home, listen, one or two, maybe. I give it a 0.25% success rate if I were to estimate it in my mind. A few of those people, meaning the lowest, the lowest number you can think of, they might take that flyer home, type your URL into their web browser, and discover you that way. But the vast, overwhelming majority are throwing that flyer away as soon as they are out of eyesight, as soon as they can do it, or they stuff it in that bag that they're carrying with them that has 110 blue million other things that they're never going to look at again, or throw away as soon as they get home. If your promotion is not clickable, if that promotion does not involve somebody immediately, in the moment, not 5 minutes from now, not when they get back home, if it isn't clickable in that moment and takes them to your website, then you're doing half-ass promotion. You might as well not be doing promotion. It's ineffective. It has a super low ROI. It's useless. And those are the three reasons people give to go to a comic convention as an exhibitor. Number one, to sell. Number two, to network. And number three, to promote. You can network without a table. Your promotion is probably useless. And if you ain't making money after expenses, and you got to be honest with yourself about that. If you're not making honestly money after expenses, after the math, you're wasting your time. And you need to be realistic about that. I had to be realistic about that because this is a business. If you have not developed your comic to the point where it's a business yet, you need to get used to making these kinds of decisions or it never will be a business. Those are just the truth. Those are just the hard facts. So, comic conventions. For me, they're out. Hit the comments below. Let me hear from you. Let me know what you think. Maybe I'm full of it. Maybe you've got it. Maybe you've got a reason that this is still a good idea. Hit the comments. Let me know what you think. This is Webcomics Confidential. Brad Guigar, thank you, and we'll see you next time.